There's a theory that I like to call the velocity constraint, which is that a business can only grow as fast as its ability to maintain the ratio of paid to organic customer acquisition.
Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Perfectly Mentored. I'm your host, Jason Portnoy. My guest in this episode is Taylor Holiday. He is the managing partner, CEO of Common Thread Collective, an online growth agency. He is also the partner of 4x400. When it comes to the e-commerce landscape and online marketing, very few people are as knowledgeable and as analytical and know their numbers as well as Taylor Holiday. You're going to love this one. If you're in the e-commerce landscape or you're in the e-commerce business, this is the episode for you. Check it out. Taylor, my man, thank you. Thank you for joining me.
Yeah, absolutely, Jason.
Like a long time coming. You and I speak here and there on Twitter, and we've had a couple of calls, but I want to dive in because I think you could be super impactful for e-commerce brands listening today. So if it's okay with you, let's just dive right in.
Let's rock, man. Let's rock.
All right. So 2020 ecom boom. Lots of
Yeah.
factors, obviously. We know that. What's in store for 2021, 2022?
Yeah, man. So it's funny. I feel like I'm becoming this growing ecom bear in a way, but I want to sort of draw a distinction. So on the macro, people are going to keep buying things on the internet more and more and more. I think categorically, e-commerce is going to continue to grow and thrive. And I think maybe what we'll see is more sort of an elimination of some of these siloed definitions where purchases are just going to sort of be happening everywhere. The transaction layer of the internet is going to sort of broaden in its scope a little bit. But on a more micro basis in our world, and when I say our world, I'm speaking for you and I working primarily in consumer product e-com, earlier stage businesses. There's a couple of things that I'm fairly concerned about. One of them that I haven't talked about much lately is that there's a lot of leverage in the system. And what I mean by that is like debt and debt that is not super awesome. I think we've seen a lot of lenders that have provided a unique lending mechanism into the e-commerce world, which is beneficial in that, most lending is traditionally a bank mechanism, right? Which is based on historical performance. Well, when you've got a lot of early stage businesses in e-commerce, direct to consumer, there aren't a lot of historical data to get loans off of, right? And so there's been this sort of upstart of new financing mechanisms that are based more on Facebook performance or short-term historicals or even forecasting and projection. And it's a really cool mechanism that helps people get going. The danger is that there's not a lot of room for failure in these businesses or reduction in efficiency and performance. And one of the things we all know is that a lot of e-commerce businesses are also over leveraged on Facebook in terms of being the primary growth engine. And so as you combine these two things with a third factor, which is iOS and privacy updates and the chaos that that's causing, there's a little bit of a storm brewing, I think, that's going to hurt a lot of small businesses if there is a meaningful reduction in performance out of their primary growth channel that I don't know that they're going to be able to sustain. E-commerce businesses generally run on fairly lean margin. I mean, if you're running at plus 15% EBITDA, like that's really good in e-commerce. So there's not a lot of room generally. You combine that with some supply chain issues that are happening still as a result of stuff. A lot more competition, both from the top down. You see big D2C or big CPG and Fortune 500 companies that are now prioritizing e-com more than ever, along with the stat I like to reference is Harley Finkelstein from Shopify talks about that every 28 seconds, there's a new Shopify store owner that makes their first sale. And now every bit of digital real estate from search engine results page to Instagram feeds are hyper competitive. And when you think about competitive markets, one of the things that they do is all the profits get competed away by that competition. So I think there's going to be a bump in the road here that's going to be a challenge that everyone's going to have to regroup on how we think about and grow these businesses and the rate at which they're growing.
And factor in, I mean, a lot of these brands are also looking at LY numbers.
Right.
Right. So how do you deal with that with your clients who are like, well, last year we just had our craziest year ever, and we want to grow this year.
Yeah.
But there's so many factors that contributed to their growth last year that aren't in play now.
Yeah, and a lot of people sort of they off the back of last year they experienced this sort of they went from a linear growth curve to a more of a parabolic one in terms of their rate, and then they look at this year and they say, hey, we want to continue this 30% month over month growth or 50% year over year growth, and you're just dealing with a different environment than that was. And for some brands, there's momentum that was built out of that, and they're brands that have really meaningful LTVs, so their new huge customer base is driving those things forward, and it works. In other cases, you have businesses that took advantage of acquisition arbitrage in moments that doesn't exist this year. And so sustaining those numbers is not going to be the same. And so one of the things we're finding ourselves having to spend a lot more time on is level setting expectations for each individual brand and really wrestling together. And I think this is the good work that a good agency partner has to do, right? Is to really spend time frankly, like arguing back and forth about why we believe what we believe about what's going to happen and come to a consensus on a reasonable expectation of growth with understanding for the error bars in each direction and what might cause them. And I think right now we're just in a period where everyone's forecast should bake in a little bit more margin of error because of the environment that we're in currently.
And it will also lead to, look, if you're a brand listening and you hired an agency and you don't buy into what they're saying, go look elsewhere. And if you're an agency, and your client's not buying into what you're saying, then it's only going to lead to more headaches. Maybe that's the best way to part ways.
And I think that's so right is that this job is about set expectations, meet expectations. And if you can't agree on the expectation, that the relationship will break. And if someone genuinely believes that there's an opportunity to produce something different than you have, then send them off to find it, and I think vice versa. Like if you think, that there's less opportunity and they're sort of confused by that, then your job is to convince them of the upside of the opportunity. And that's where one of the things I tell our people a lot is like, in some ways, your job is to be a lawyer and to come and present the best possible case for the outcome you believe in. And the client gets to be sort of the judge and jury, but your job is to bring a compelling case for what you believe and to get them to agree with your position. And you have to use the advantage that you should have as an agency is you should have broader contextual data. So you should be able to show them more contextually what's happening in the environment that informs your decision. More data in terms of historical forecasting impact, methodology that allows you to bring to the table an informed opinion that the client in theory has hired you to offer them. So the best
Which
relationship.
is hard though. Like, let's be honest, which is hard for smaller agencies or
That's
freelancers
totally
who
fair.
who they don't want to turn down the money. But
That's
like
right.
if they could start thinking the long game of like, you have to be able to turn down the money, you have to be able to choose the right clients that you're able to have success with and win. But it's just such a hard mentality for when you're starting off to grasp.
Yeah, and one of the things I think we get a little romantic sometimes about this idea that every client needs to be the perfect client. One of the things
Yeah.
that we talk about is this idea of an acceptable failure rate, which is like anybody who would tell me that they have a 100% retention rate for their clients, I would argue that what that represents is not enough demand creation and they're not taking enough risks on opportunities. Vice versa, if you tell me you have a 20% retention rate, it's probably the other side of the problem. But the question is like, what is the acceptable failure rate where you're going to take on opportunities where maybe you're not sure if you can convince the client. Maybe you're not sure if the product will work, but you need to go find out. You need to work in this new area to learn how to develop that skill. Now you've got to be clear on from a financial outcome what is an acceptable failure rate for your business. But I think that you don't always know and can't always predict up front what the perfect relationships are going to be and who they're going to be with. And that's, it's like dating, right? Like
Yeah.
you've gotten to know each other a little bit in the sales process, but until you really get into a relationship, you're not totally sure how people are going to behave.
And just like in marriage, finances are number one reason for divorce. So
That's right. Exactly right.
Um,
Exactly right.
but you talk about the acceptable failure rate, but it's a hard thing to do when most brands don't even know what their acceptable success rate is, right? They don't even know what the rules of the game that they're playing is and what success is. Do you think that's one of the biggest, I guess, problems between agency and client is that the client doesn't know what success should even look like?
Yeah, that's a great question, Jason. I think I think that there are a lot of factors that go into what someone feels like, and I use the word feeling important because I think a lot of times it's more emotional than logical. They should be getting out of a partner, and a lot of that is like they heard a story about a thing, about a brand that was growing at a certain pace, and then like that like internalizes for them some projected expectation onto their relationship, or there's a ton of factors that go into it, and the reality is like especially if you're working with earlier stage businesses. Um, like myself or any other entrepreneur, I don't know where you were at financially when you started, Jason, but like their level of financial sophistication and understanding of their business is fairly low. And so the idea of like, what does it even mean to produce free cash flow, or what does it even mean to sort of pursue EBITDA, and in what window am I trying to maximize profit, are not actually questions that you consider. So often early days are just like, I'm just trying to survive, right? And then this question of like, what am I actually trying to accomplish in what time period is not something you necessarily spend a ton of time considering. And sometimes that's the key, is to get people to slow down and go, what are we actually trying to do? Right. And this is, I tell people a lot, like, we're a tool to accomplish an outcome, but if you're unclear on the outcome, we're really not going to be that helpful, because we're not going to know what it is that you're after and how to help you accomplish it.
Totally agree. Um, how important nowadays, more than ever, um, for an ecom store is it to build a brand versus just selling products?
Yeah. So I think for me, I'll define the word brand as two sort of, I think, metrics that just very simply, and this is probably an oversimplification of what brand really means, but one is like brand and brand awareness are direct traffic, right? It's that people know you and type your name into the browser bar independent of you having to advertise to them. And then the second one is LTV, is like they are connected to your brand and they come back and want to buy more, assuming you're in a product category where that's actually part of the workflow. But those two elements are hypercritical to success, right? If you can't actually build organic reputational connection with your customer, you won't, at some point, your scale will be restricted. Like, and so this idea of brand, I think sometimes for people feels philosophical. It doesn't feel practical. Like, they don't know exactly what it means. But I think that what I see show up time and time again in our best brands is that if you look at their traffic pie, we call it, a diversity of their channel traffic, you know what they do? They're getting traffic from lots of sources, because they drive these organic viral marketing loops where people talk about their product and they share it on social and they do these things, right? And then there's this like general, they have other marketing stuff going on besides just Facebook, and so people show up in direct traffic and organic search and these other places, and they have an email list that's growing and customers that are coming back because the product's amazing. And it's like a halo there, and it begins to grow around the growth engine that you're doing, that is so critical to success. That and brand is like, it's a thing that amplifies over time. And so it's really hard to just insert it. You can't just have brand tomorrow, right? Like, it just doesn't work that way, right? But it's an investment in a reputation that leads to these factors that allow you to continue to grow profitably.
So then how important is omnipresence now?
Yeah. So this is another thing that I think I would say I'm even coming to appreciate more and more, is the power of having your product everywhere. And so we talked, I mentioned this in the beginning. One of my main sort of visions of the future is this idea that like the transactional layer of the internet is going to detach from websites. Like, websites are going to be an artifact. It's going to be a thing that we're like, wait, you had to go to a website to buy things, versus like, in my mind, like, we should be able to, Jason, say something right now that's like, oh, you know what? I love these glasses from Gooder. I wear them when I'm running. And someone should be like, buy those glasses. And in whether it's through voice, or whether it's through some AR factor, or whether it's an interactive layer on top of video, like, the cart mechanism won't matter to them. Like, they won't care where it is. They just want the product, and it'll be transactionally delivered to them. And I've seen so many cool things that people are doing that are empowering this. And so when we think about omni-channel, I think the point is like, you want to be everywhere people are. And so the question is, where are people? And for a long time, it's like,
more importantly, where are your people? Like,
yes,
where are your
right.
customers, right? Like, people
That's
are
right.
people are everywhere, but maybe your customers aren't.
That's right. And so like, when I think about, like, you look at China and you see the sort of like social commerce layer that gets built into their world, that's like, it just feels like we haven't cracked it yet. Like, we haven't found the thing that does that. But when I think about all these places that are aggregating people, whether it's like Discord or Twitch or YouTube or these places, or TikTok, there's these massive amounts of attention and presence. Like, commerce is gonna happen in those places, and you see it sort of in different form factors all the time. But the same thing then is true for retail. Like, one of the things I had a chance to do recently is I've had a chance to interact with some big legacy mall retailers. And when you see the amount of organic traffic that these brands drive on the basis of being in every mall in America, it is just mind-boggling the level of brand awareness they have in comparison to these D2C brands that are just vertical on ecom. Like it's just a completely different thing. So I think that is going to be more and more an obligation that brands have, is to go out and meet the customers and their specific customers in their presence.
So I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this, because I used to be a I've always been a big believer in brand and building a brand. The thing that changed for me a little bit more recently is I've kind of moved from spending money on branding
Mm,
versus branding as as a result of sales, right? That
interesting.
everything should kind of come from a direct response point of view. Everything should kind of have a call to action that should lead to sales, that should go to branding. That money on top of branding, unless you're and I think that's what the little brands do wrong, right? They look at Nike, they look at all the big brands, and they're like, oh, I got to go put up this billboard. Oh, I got to go do all this and follow them. I'm just curious to hear your thoughts on that.
So I think that there's a both and here that doesn't require it to be an either or thing. So I'll give you an example. When we were running Kalo, okay, one of the things that we thought about in terms of brand is like our reputation with all the people who influence people in the space. Okay, so when we would do product seeding as an example, so every time we had a product launch, and let's say we were going into the CrossFit industry, okay, one of the things that we would do is we would build a list of all of the most influential people in the space, and I don't just mean the athletes. We would go to all of the brand executives for all the coolest brands in the space.
Hmm.
And I would look like, who's their CMO, who's their CEO, who runs digital for them, who's out with the athletes for them. And we would send them product as well. Okay. And we would make sure that what happened was that everybody who was cool in that community was connected to us because we wanted to trade on their reputation, right? And we knew that in that community, if their brand, which they had worked really hard to establish, was aligned with our brand, we would gain ancillary value from that. So we would give them product, and Kalo's a unique brand in that like the cost of the goods is super low. So we had an advantage here that I know some brands can't do and replicate. But for me, in that instance, what we're doing is we're building a foundation for how people perceive the product when they see the ad. Okay. And I think this is actually a really important thing to think about, is the dots you're connecting for people after they see your ad. So if I can have an experience where they walk in and they saw the CMO of, Good RX or whatever, like whatever the cool brand is that they're working with, and they go, "Oh, I saw that on so and so's finger," and then I saw the ad. Now I've created an experience that's amplifying the power of my direct response. So the one thing by itself, like just sending the product, insufficient, right? Like it's probably not going to lead the purchase. But in combination, these things, now I would agree with you that that's all about the direct response. That's at the end of the day, that's about the sale. But there's this foundational effect that you're trying to create around your advertising to assist it, to lubricate the sale, if you will, that I think is really critical as well.
Yeah, I think that's well said. I think that comes into personal branding too, even on the personal brand side,
Totally.
and it's like the whole story of, right, when you go to buy a car, and then you start seeing that car
Right.
all
Right.
over the streets and everywhere you look. I think that's exactly what you're referring to, right?
That's it. That's exactly it. And that was exactly how we thought about it, is we wanted people to be like, I've seen this everywhere by the
Yeah.
time they now get hit with the ad in their Instagram feed, right? And so you've primed them, which is sort of the psychological effect that you'll see, like people who like get you to say numbers out loud, right? Like what they've done is they've like sort of subtly placed them in front of you over and over again. And the same is true for marketing, right? You want, by the time that ad shows up, someone to be like, this is cool, like, and they don't even know why they know that it's cool, right?
Yeah.
And this is what happens, like a lot of times, people describe like Facebook and Instagram as like they're listening to me, right? Like they must be listening. But and it's just a priming effect, right? Which is that along the way somehow you've had some digital interaction that you weren't even aware that you had, that the data has signaled that you had, and so we showed it to you, and that priming effect is the thing that you're
Well,
experiencing in that moment.
it's how our brains are wired, right? It's wired to make us, we process so much information at a given moment that it just
Right.
goes to what's relative, or what we remember, or what makes sense to us. The brain does a good
Right.
job. So when you see an ad, it's chances are, and you're like, oh, it's listening to me. It's because it's filtering through a ton of information of
That's right.
all the other ads that didn't speak to you.
That's right. Yeah. And there's just like, we are actually really bad at recalling all of our interactions. Like if I, like if
Correct.
I asked
Yeah.
you like the last 10 ads you saw on Instagram, like you wouldn't know. And yet we're so quick to be like, they're listening to me, but we can't even recall what we've ever interacted with on the internet. Like we have no idea.
Exactly.
Right. So,
Yeah.
yeah. And that's why I think that there's this, like, when we even to get into like the sort of Facebook idea of why why sort of allowing them to do the targeting in some ways versus you sort of predefining interest groups in these things, it's based on this exact idea, right? Is that they have the data points and signals they have relative to each user's behavior is way better than some sort of like broadly defined interest that you're making an assumption about, right? And it's this same idea.
I want to go back to something you said. Harley said that every 28 seconds, a new Shopify store gets their first sale, right?
Yeah.
So obviously the landscape has changed for e-commerce. We got rising costs of advertising that aren't going away anytime soon.
Right.
What's a strategy for e-com brands to win today, tomorrow, and then in future months?
Gosh, yeah. I think I have this sort of thing I put out called this idea of like the anti-fragile e-commerce playbook, and it's really about giving yourself the best odds at success. Okay, e-commerce is freaking hard. Building any business from scratch is super hard. Entrepreneurs are sort of insane in their like ability to go take on something that has a 90% failure rate in like just right from the start. But what you want to do is you want to set up a game that gives you the best odds at success. And so when I think about e-com, I want to think about what that is. And so depending on what your primary growth engine is, let's assume you don't have a big following on social, or you don't have a blog or a YouTube channel that you're starting with a collection of people. You're going to be using, the growth channels that we're all familiar with. Well, in those places, we see on average, like this year, 2021, a 50th percentile ROAS is about 1.9 to 1, right? So that means that you're giving away 55% of your revenue on that acquisition. Well, that only works under a specific set of conditions. It only works if you have lots of margin. Okay. So having a really high margin product gives you more room for error and opportunity, right? Or you have a really high LTV, right? So when you can acquire that first purchase, those customers are actually going to come back and buy a bunch more, and you're going to make incremental revenue that will create your margin, right? And then, so that's like one set of attributes is margin and LTV that you want to think about. The second then is like the relationship that you have with the supplier for your product. Like e-commerce businesses get destroyed and die primarily on a cash basis. Like it's a very hard cash flow management game. And so the longer the lead time is in the production of your product, so in other words, if I have to place an order for inventory and I don't receive it for like, let's say 12 weeks, well, what that requires of you then is to make predictions about your revenue really far in advance. And if there's anything I have watched with absolute certainty, it's that businesses are horrible at forecasting their revenue. So what happens is if you forecast your revenue, the further out you go, the less likely you are to be accurate. And so if you can make it, that's why like print on demand became such a big e-commerce business, because it eliminates inventory risk, right? It requires that you don't have to pay for the thing till you sell it. Right now, the problem there is margin. It's a different issue altogether. But the idea is really powerful in that like it reduces a primary risk of death. So like, can you go negotiate with your supplier, or can you use tools like Settle that provide financing that alter that cash conversion cycle for you as best as possible? And so there's all these little ways in which you can create opportunity for you to have a better chance at success. Now you still got to go do all the good marketing things, and you got to have a great product, and your website has to work, and you have to make great ads, and like all of that is true. But before that, I think a lot about what I call the genetic attributes of the business, right? Like it's like, what is true of it at its core? And can you alter any of those things before you start, and to think about them deeper before you decide this is a great product category to go into?
Yeah. Two things I'd add to there is one is like, it's fine if you're going to get a ROAS like that and lose that type of money on acquisition, if you have a really good back end in place and you have solid upsells
Right.
along the way, you're fine. And then number two is, I've seen businesses that have such quick, easy wins in terms of making more money when you look at their operating costs, and it's like 60% of their
There you
revenue.
go. Yeah, that's another one of the points is like when you think about the benefit of this business versus the agency business, right? In the agency business, like my OpEx as a percentage of revenue is like 60 to 65% every month. People are the entire cost center of the business. E-commerce is the exact opposite, right? You should be at sub 25%, really sub 15%, your OpEx as a percentage of revenue, because you can run really, really lean. There's like not as much human capital that's required. And so, yeah, every one of those pieces gives you more opportunity to win, even when there's inevitable peaks and valleys along the journey.
Cookies going away.
Yeah.
Tracking, poof, awful. Attribution, awful.
A mess. Yeah.
How should brands look at their strategy, I guess, and you're telling them to start measuring these things and plan an attack and forecast revenue. How can they look at their strategy and measure success when every platform is losing reporting or double attributing, or like, it's crazy. I've seen brands scale on on 6 different channels, but they were getting like 5x on every single channel, but they were losing money.
The total reported revenue is larger than the website revenue. Yeah.
Exactly. So your triple report, a triple attribution. How can they measure their advertising and marketing success? And what does marketing even look like in the new world?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think we're in very real time discovering the answer to that. And this is one of those things that I've seen some people with a perspective that's like long term. What this is going to force the industry to do is going to be healthy, and that we're going to have a lot more first party data. You're going to be a lot more focused on thinking about the quality of the content that you're creating versus like the mechanisms of optimization. And in the long run, that might be true, but there's going to be pain along the way. And I think at the end of the day, like I put out a tweet the other day, sort of a joke, but it's like the best attribution mechanism is your checking account. And it's like this idea that you have to start from the top down, and then you have to try and correlate the results as best as you can, right? So we always focus revenue and MER, so total sales over total ad spend, and we look at that ratio. And then we try and understand the primary growth engines of that, right? So you have to get clear on your customer journey. So one thing I like to look at a lot is like time lag reports or path length reports, right? Where you go and see like, okay, how many visits on average is it for my customers to make a purchase? How many days? And so in that, you can begin to understand how your customer thinks about buying. Then you can think about what role an ad might play in that journey, right? So you can say, like, if you have a brand where you go to the path length report in Google Analytics and you see that 80% of your purchases happen on the first visit, okay? Well, what that can tell me is that the primary, like, first touch attribution models, the things that are driving the initial visit, are really, really valuable and important to me, right? Now, if I have a longer consideration phase where it turns out that only 40% of my purchases happen on the first visit, now I've probably got a more complicated attribution model that's going to involve a lot more touches along the way. And I've got to think about the application of that journey. Now, it's important for me to understand what they're doing when they leave, because a lot of times what that signals is that there's an additional layer of consideration that often is like they're going to YouTube and reading reviews, or they're searching product reviews. And you've got to think about not just the advertising mechanism, but how are you meeting the customer in their journey? And so sometimes it's like, yeah, attribution, advertising, but it's really taking a step back and going, how does my customer buy my product? And how do I meet them where they're at? And what are the available tools to do that, right? Because as you sort of lose the ability to go, okay, this platform is telling me the exact thing of what's happening in a way that I 100% trust. Not that anyone really ever 100% trusted Facebook, but I think it gets back more to first principles about what is happening to the customer in that process and how do I meet them there.
Aside from the fact that most businesses don't ever set up their Google Analytics correctly.
Yeah,
so
right. Well, that's a separate issue altogether. Yeah.
How important is to look at that same model on each platform?
So, when we say each platform, let's talk through sort of what we think about specifically, right? So Facebook represents, I would say, across our portfolio, about 65 to 70% of spend in reality. And it depends on the size of the business, but usually that's the primary thing, right? So on Facebook, I think that we would all agree that consideration for funnel stages is hypercritical, and really understanding, having a plan for prospecting versus website visitors versus, what we would call lapsed customers. And we're pretty diligent about excluding existing customers as a mechanism on advertising. We try as best we can to control that through owned audiences and email and SMS, with the exception of like a lot of big apparel brands that have big promotional launches where we'll sort of sequence it, where we'll allow an email to do 24 hours of work and then pick up on the customers that didn't interact with the email from there. So like there's ways to think about what role it plays in that journey. Another thing I'm like really interested in is brands that actually think about post-purchases experience on social, not just for a transactional layer, but for a brand experience layer. Like, here's how to use it. Here's how to have the best experience with the product and delivering content that way. So yeah, again, where is my customer? Who are they? What is the information they need to know right now? Super critical. Google, which is like sort of the second piece of it, is like what I would call demand capture, right? So if you think about Facebook, the primary thing is it's primarily taking someone who's not looking for your product and turning them into demand. It's demand creation. Google, you've got a different consideration for the process. There's already, if it's categorical search, meaning they're looking for shoes as an example, they're already in the purchase mindset. So you're meeting them at a different place, right? They've already moved from not looking for something into the consideration phase. And now it's about you versus somebody else, right? And so now there's a different message that you have to do, is that this person wants shoes. Now you got to tell them why they want your shoes, right? Specifically, versus like, why do they want shoes at all? Those are different things, right? So that's a different part of it. Then you could go into all the specific ad products. You could go Google Display, you could go YouTube, and all of these different things. And the question always to ask is, what is the context of the customer at the moment that they're interacting with this ad? And what do they need to know to move through that moment? One of the things I think is really surprising to people, we do this, we have at CTC, we do a thing called advertising philosophy, which is like a class we teach to our creatives. And one of the things that we show them is that, like, if you look at consumption rates of Instagram related to shopping related content, like the highest usage rates on day, if you were like look at a heat map by time and day, is Wednesday at noon. It's like the peak engagement time. And so what that means is, primarily the way that people are using the channel is as a escape from a boring middle of their day at work, right? So as you put yourself into the mindset of speaking to someone who's on break, scrolling their phone, eating lunch, bored, like now you can begin to think about how to speak to that person, right? Versus like the consumption rates are the lowest on Friday nights and Saturday nights when people are doing things, right? So you just begin to go, okay, who is my person and how do I meet them in that moment with this ad? And that's always a great thing to consider, regardless of the platform.
So, I mean, that's great advice there. But so now, like, if you're in scaling mode, what's the plan of attack there? Because how do you continue to grow revenue and profitably, I guess, without just Facebook ads? Because what you see is, even if you break it down by all these platforms, you probably, like most brands, get to a point where the reporting just Facebook just represents so much that all the other platforms, they may be showing good returns, but really Facebook's driving all that, because I guess the margins or whatever it is so wide on Facebook that it just, all the other platforms become insignificant. So how do they continue to grow without relying on Facebook?
Well, so I think the key is that there's a theory that I like to call the velocity constraint, which is that a business can only grow as fast as its ability to maintain the ratio of paid to organic customer acquisition. Okay. So let me explain what I mean. Let's imagine every month right now, you're acquiring 50% of your customers via Facebook or via paid channels and 50% organically. Okay. And on your paid channels, you're getting a 2-to-1 ROAS on that spend. That means overall, you're going to be getting a 4-to-1, because half of them are free, half of them are a 2-to-1. You'll have a 4-to-1 MER overall. Okay. Now let's imagine the next month you're like, this is great. We're making a bunch of money, 4-to-1. I'm making a bunch of profit. Let's scale the ad spend, and you double your ad spend. Okay. So now you go from 50% of your customers being paid for to 75% of them being paid for. And you actually did it while maintaining the same ROAS on the acquisition side. Well, guess what just happened? Now 75% of your customers are paid for and 25% of them are organic. And even though your Facebook ROAS stayed the same, great job agency, great job paid team, your margin was still just reduced, because now 75% of the customers that you have, you paid 50% of the cost for. So now your MER went from a 4-to-1 to down to a 3-to-1. And you're like, where'd my margin go? What just happened? I have the same ROAS on the platform, but because your organic acquisition didn't scale with it, your margin disappeared. And this is a thing people don't understand all the time. Like, we get the number one question I get asked is like, can we double spend and make the same amount of money? And it's like, no. Or I'll say, hey, yeah, sure. Can you double your direct traffic next month? Can you double your organic social? Can you double your referral traffic? Can you double your email revenue? Because if so, then I'll do the same thing and the business will make the same amount of money. But we all want to just like be able to shortcut that piece of it, but you can't. And the reality is, a great Facebook account, you know what makes a great Facebook account? Like, being able to do 60-40 prospecting to remarketing. If you start pushing it into 90-10 prospecting to remarketing because there's no other website traffic, guess what? Your ROAS is going to go down. Like, and so this idea that a great Facebook ad account is just about great prospecting advertising, it's like, no. It's a much bigger part of the puzzle that has to happen there. So you cannot scale a brand independent that organic demand, or at some point your margin is going to be reduced.
So what's their best tips on creating that organic demand?
Yeah, you have to have a plan for every channel of traffic. So if you go through, when I say channels, I think about like Google Analytics channel report. So direct, organic search, organic social, paid search, referral, right? Every one of in email, right? So those are the core channels. So in each of those, you have to break it down. So organic search, this is about SEO and content strategy, right? Like, so the question is like, do you have a set and understanding of the opportunity as it relates to that channel? And are you doing the long tail work? That's a long game. It's not a short-term fix, but to win in those channels, right? And I would even put like in that channel, one of the things I think that people don't consider as a search mechanism, and it'll actually show up in social often, is YouTube. I think is a hypercritical SEO arena for e-commerce brands because people are looking for reviews all day long in that environment. So that's like one thing. Then you go to email. Okay, how much of our revenue right now is coming from email? And what is our opportunity to improve that percentage of a slice? Organic social. How much traffic did I get last month? And if I went through and I looked and I was like, okay, well, we have X number of followers and X number of followers equals Y traffic. We did these social pushes from these influencers and it generated all whatever. Okay, what can I do to move that? Referral, which in my mind refers to like affiliates and PR and network of people that are pointing back to your website as much as possible. What are you doing in that channel? And you just break down a strategy against every one of these, and you create KPIs and obligations to people in your organization to help you achieve outcomes in every channel, not just your agency on the paid side. Because you can't just
so you mean it's hard? It's actually work to build a brand, and you can't just rely on Facebook ads?
No, and this is like, I think sometimes agencies do themselves a disservice by not making clear to a client what their obligation is in this partnership too. When I think about
and I know you do this too, but like we do this all the time, that like, look, if we're going to succeed, majority of the success is going to come from you guys, not us.
That's right.
Right. We're gasoline on the fire. We're not the back end of your business.
No, exactly. And we like to frame it as like our job, your job. Here's our job. Here's your job. And if we're both clear on that and we both do it, then we're going to win. But if either one of us fails, it's not going to work because we are not managing these hypercritical portions of your business, right? And we don't have the capacity to. You don't want us doing it, candidly. You don't want us doing product development for you. Like that's not who our people are. I got no engineers over here, like building product or chemists or anything like that. Like you've got to go figure that piece out. But if you don't, if you have no product moments throughout the calendar that are driving new engagement from your existing customers, your ad account is going to be not as good. Like that's just the reality of it. So if you can't help us to manufacture moments, and our best brands are like, they're pumping out licensing partnerships with Disney, and then they launch this new rad thing. And it's like, that makes our job really freaking easy, right? When you do rad stuff. So all of this is this like combined effort where the best brands own their part of the responsibility too.
So now let's make it a little bit trickier, because this is all great when you have a brand that has proven sales and they're going out and they have money to invest. If a company is, or someone's just getting into the e-commerce space right now, brand new store, and they're listening to this, what's the plan of attack right out of the gate?
Gosh, I mean, it's so hard to know without being able to be specific to the product category. But what I would say is that I would think really, really hard about what your growth strategy is on a channel basis. Like, so if I think about, so I'll use a couple of our examples because we acquire early stage brands. So like Bamboo Earth, our skincare line. The growth plan for that business is all about the fact that we can acquire customers at a really low ROAS because the margin is awesome and the LTV is high. So the growth strategy from the beginning was we can go.
I'm going to stop you because you don't know that if you just open up a new store today.
Why not? You've got to know your margin.
No, you don't know your LTV. But
you've got to have a theory, right? So you've got to have a hypothesis about how you're going to grow the business. And what I would say is like, if you're selling $300 leather wallets that last forever, it's not an LTV game. Yeah. Okay. Like if you're selling skincare, it's an LTV game. Like, so the question, you've got to have a hypothesis about how you're going to grow. Right. And so, because that's going to inform the growth strategy. Like with this business, like I can't acquire customers at break even. Like it doesn't work. I'll go out of business because there is no LTV coming. Right. So in that case, I've got to think a lot about the opportunities in other ways. And the question is like, who holds the audience that you want, right? So if you want people to show up to your website, like the first part of our growth formula is visitors. There's none of the other stuff matters if visitors don't show up. It's the primary thing, right? So where are your visitors? In what audiences can you access? Whether that's, do they aggregate in Facebook groups? Are there Discord channels? Are there influencers? Are there people that you can brute force grunt hard work of just all day long trying to get into communities to get people to show up to your website? Like, yeah, that's a lot of the early days is what I would do is like 1,000 DMs and 1,000 Facebook messages and a bunch of outreach. Like that's the early days, right? It's just a grunt work to get your first 1,000 visitors to the website. If you are somebody who's good at creating content, you can build an ad funnel and you have like an ability there, you can fire that up. But again, I would be really clear on what the success metric is that you need. And as you do your profit calculation, if it comes back and you need a 3-to-1 ROAS, I would be like, oh, I would be careful, because very few businesses fire up their first Facebook ads and it's immediately pumping at that. So you might be in trouble and you might want to hold off on that channel for now because you don't want to light money on fire because it's very precious to you. So that's where it's like understanding the rules of the thing determine then how you have to play it. And if you don't have the margin, you can't play a paid media game. You now have to go do the grunt work of organic traffic.
I love that, because everyone thinks, paid media is the end all be all. Yes, I think if you could afford to do it. It will speed up time and speed things up for you, and you'll get data a lot quicker. Data quicker, not results quicker. And data quicker.
You have to decide, because one of the things, like, it's funny, like even I had a brand that was talking with their Facebook rep and they were like, you should really break out your international into these specific countries and like you'll get some learnings and blah, blah, blah. And so I was like, hold on, is that what you want? Do you want learning? Because I'm not doing anything to try and generate you learning. If the end result is you want information, like we'll change what we're doing. And she's like, no, it's not. I want revenue. And I was like, I know you do. Like, so just understand that when you receive advice like that and the output that they're offering you is information, you don't want information at the end of the day. I know you don't. Right. So to your point, like if you're going to try and generate data, just be clear that that's what you're doing. And that also means likely not money.
For sure. But like there are some cases where I want that type of stuff. Right. I just want to know the headline that's working well. I just want to know this. I want to know if that audience is resonating with it. But I agree, if you're starting off as an e-commerce business, money in.
And a lot of times, like what we'll get is like we worked a long time like in a fitness brand, and so they were sort of curious about two different fitness communities. Does community A produce better or community B produce better? And then where we're going to go develop roots and focus. And so we're running sort of campaigns to provide an answer, but the answer is a revenue answer, right? It's like which one makes us more money.
But I love it. At the end of the day, those clients come back and what happened to our ROAS?
Right, exactly.
Well, you want to spend money to test us? No. I just need money. Stop it.
And it's funny because testing is an interesting thing that like I'm like pretty contrarian in that like I hate the premise. Like I think anytime someone tells you they want you to test a bunch of things, what they really mean is that they want you to make money, and they think the mechanism by which you should do that is this process that they have in their mind. Because like testing is just a word that like people like use, like this thing you're supposed to be doing. But the reality is like the way that Facebook works is like it's always a test, right? Like that's like the entire thing is like every time you launch an ad, it's a test against a premise. So like then the idea that you would set up a separate thing that's a test is like sort of confusing to me. Like
no, I would say all of paid media is a test. It's
literally what you're doing every time is like I have an idea about an ad that I hope is going to work, that I'm running to an audience that I'm trying to deliver an outcome against, and we're going to find out, test if it's going to work. That's what it is, the whole thing.
What are the biggest mistakes you see e-commerce brands making?
I think it's on the financing side. They actually aren't clear how to capitalize the outcome that they want. And they aren't connecting the demand planning on the inventory side with the growth side. So you have media buying people that are sort of operating on a ROAS basis with no consideration for what they're selling, right? They don't care what they're selling. They're just trying to find an ad anywhere that generates the ROAS that they have to hit their KPI or not get fired or whatever. And that has no consideration for the purchases that you just made of the product, right? So that's what, like, that's on the inventory side. On the capitalization side, like, so I'll give you an example. I'm having a conversation with, and this is probably on the later stage, but like a business who right now is thinking about going out to raise some money as a mechanism to take some chips off the table. They've done an awesome job. They have a great business, and on an EBITDA basis, they're producing, about $6 million in profit. The problem is their bank account never has $6 million in it, right? So they don't produce any free cash flows. And it's because they're an apparel business and they're on this constant inventory cycle of every time they get money in, they're buying the next batch of inventory. And so even though they're profitable $6 million, which is a huge number, like they could never give themselves $6 million, right? And so they're looking at this and they're like, the way I could put money in my pocket is I have to sell my equity and then I'll get cash. And that's my way I create liquidity for myself. Versus looking at their cash conversion cycle and trying to understand what is clearly eating up the cash and trying to negotiate terms such that they produce more free cash flow that they could actually put in their pocket. Because what they want is to figure out how to put money in their pocket, but they can't figure out how to do it, even though the business is quote unquote profitable. And I see this all the time in e-commerce where they're like, wait, at the end of the month, my P&L says I made money, but there's no cash in the bank. Where's the money that I could pay myself? And entrepreneurs are sort of exhausted by it.
Yeah, it's funny that you say that, because I think what they look at is, I mean, I think people are looking at their business kind of the wrong way, in the sense of like, they're putting all this money in, like you're saying, not realizing where they could pull out from, they're negotiating the wrong things. Put it that way. They're trying to negotiate prices of advertising on the platforms versus negotiating everything else. Like, oh, I wish our CPMs were lower. How about you get longer terms with your vendor? How about you do a bunch of these things?
Just understanding the debt facilities that are available to them, right? Like, so to understand, and I've mentioned Settle before, and I just love them because it's like inventory financing in a way that allows you to upside your cash conversion cycle. But even if you go get a line of credit on your AR and you realize that you can use this debt cycle to be able to manage cash flow in a way that you could pull cash out of the business and also manage like low rate debt, like that's a skill that not a lot of entrepreneurs have, because I've gone through this a lot too. My biggest journey, like as you mature as a business, is you go from what I would call like a capital producer, meaning you're trying to make money show up and you're only worried about, can I get enough money into the business to survive, to suddenly you have money and you have to figure out how to become a capital allocator and what to do to maximize those dollars. And it's like a very different skill set. And you don't have one until you get there, right? Like, and so you have to learn it. And what I see is like, even in the instances when people succeed, they don't understand how to make the business produce money for them. And that skill and the management of the available debt opportunities and the financing sophistication to be able to do that is hard. And it's a latent skill that I think is like a devoid in the industry. And it's sort of like, as we're all maturing into this, it's a new thing that we're having to figure out.
We'll wrap up with some rapid fire. Most underrated channel or strategy for e-commerce brands.
Most underrated channel. God, I wish there was something that was just like really awesome and underrated. So one of my favorite things that like I'm seeing some businesses do is like, and again, if this goes back to, if you have the cost of goods to support this, but product seeding as a mechanism for content generation and distribution. If like when we at Kalo, we would send our product to everybody who mattered, and the amount of value that we generated out of LeBron James wearing Kalo around, Steph Curry, Mike Trout, like all these people without ever paying them a dollar, because we created something cool and we created distribution for them, and that content showed up in places and you were able to use it in sort of cool ways that showed off to Dick's Sporting Goods. Look at how cool this all is, even though you couldn't run it in an ad. Like, it's a massively underappreciated way to build relationships and connections that will matter to you. And like, so we have a sister agency called Kinship, and they do this whole program, which is about content seeding to micro influencers for the sake of generating content that you can use in Facebook ads. That's the whole flow. Yep. And like, if you seed your product to 100 people, I think their rates are like 25% of them will produce content for free for you. And so it's like, there's this whole way in which you can engage. You can do this with your existing customers. You can do this with small micro content creators, and content is so precious and hard to produce that if you can get people who are socially native creators to build a flow for you, it's really, really valuable asset. So that's not like a direct, like tomorrow you make traffic or show up, but I think as a foundational part of your brand ecosystem, it's critical.
Most important metrics for an e-commerce brand to look at.
So the ones that I would focus on are MER, so total sales over total ad spend, revenue. I know that's a fancy one. Contribution margin, so basically how much money is left over after every variable cost is delivered to the customer. And then what we would call 60-day LTV. So those are the four things that we start every conversation with our brand to go after.
It's funny you say revenue. I'm kind of a believer that revenue is kind of like this vanity metric that, it's very easy to spend $2 million or $5 million to make $3 million. Looks good. Revenue looks good. I'm a $3 million brand, but you're essentially losing money.
Yeah, well, but the problem is like if I just give you the other three, so if I just give you margin, LTV, and MER, it doesn't tell you how many dollars you actually put in your pocket either, right? So I think any of these metrics by themselves is insufficient, and that's really the key. Is that the top line does matter. It has an impact on how many total dollars that you have available to you, and it matters when combined with a consideration for the efficiency of your advertising, the margin of the product, and really OPEX. You could throw another one in there, like this idea that you keep OPEX sub 15% of revenue would be another metric that I think is important to consider. But like the reality is like we want it to be this one thing that you look at, but that's not how it works. Like you've got to consider the relationship between all these variables. And at the end of the day, like the overall amount of money that you generate is really meaningful. It's just not meaningful by itself.
If you could grab e-commerce store owners and shake sense into them and just grab them and shake them, what would be the one thing you'd want them to hear?
Spend more time thinking about your supply chain than you do your Facebook ad account.
All right.
Just like,
So
yeah.
yeah,
You
no,
can
you could
rapid
go
fire.
deeper if you want to.
I just think that like it's a mental shortcut to obsess about your Facebook ad account because it's so available to you and it's easy and it's accessible. The other stuff is harder and slower and less obvious. But the idea that the way that you're going to grow your business is if your growth mechanism is triple my ad spend and hold my ROAS or improve my ROAS, it's
Yeah.
not going to happen. You won't do it. It's not going to work.
Love that. Perfect. Switching gears in order to wrap up, something you're really big on is culture. What are the top five, I guess, must have, like, call it rules or call it tactics to create a great working culture?
So you have to have a definition of values that includes behaviors. Okay. So people will often say things like our values are honesty and whatever, but they don't give you an example of what it means inside of your honesty. So or in your organization. So honesty is we would never report on a 28-day click, 28-day view attribution model, right? Like you have to translate the value into behavior and then you have to celebrate and exemplify the behavior all throughout the organization, right? So we do this thing, one of our of our values, every Friday we do something that we call chips, right? And we've created these little like symbols, status symbols for each one of the values. And we have a company meeting where we celebrate each other through the chips. So if you're a new person and you show up, someone says like, I want to, give so-and-so a chip for candor with kindness. That's one of our values. This idea that you give feedback honestly, but you do it with a consideration and empathy, right? And so they'll give an example of when someone displayed that value and recognized them. So as a new person, you show up and you see the behaviors that the company exemplifies and resembles. And so the key is you make your values clear on the front so people can opt into them, so they know they align with them and then match them. You give them examples of behaviors that show what it actually looks like for those things to come to life. And then you celebrate and point them out as you go to reinforce the behavior.
Must have apps or for managing your teams and clients in a remote environment?
Marco Polo. That's like probably the answer that most people will like. I love Loom. We use Asana, we use Slack, but the one I use to most with manage my personal direct reports is Marco Polo. It's asynchronous video messaging. So I don't like typing. I would much rather talk. And it's in a remote world. I also hate synchronous meetings. I try as best as I can not to put shared time on the calendar because it's really hard to get 6 people together and have a shared time, like plan weeks in advance, right? Like, but if I'm thinking about something and I want to communicate it to you, I can send it to you on a video message. And the expectation is when you watch it, you get a chance, you can respond. And it's built real face-to-face human connection. It also frees people up to talk because they're sort of by themselves, they're processing, and you get really like stream of consciousness, honest interaction. And I use it with entrepreneurs all over the world. Like if you have a question, if you DM me on Twitter and ask me a question, what I'm going to tell you is send it to me on Marco Polo and I'll get back to you when I can.
Love it. Taylor, thank you so much for doing this. For the people who want to reach out, how can they find you?
Taylor Holiday on Twitter is my favorite place. My DMs are open. Love to meet people on there. It's how Jason and I got connected. It's an amazing community on there. And then we're commonthreadco.com if you want to come hang out with us on the business side.
Awesome. Thank you, Taylor. Really appreciate you.
Yeah, buddy. Appreciate you.
Hey, everyone. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you want, check out our most recent video over here. And this one is the one YouTube thinks you'll like. But if you really enjoyed watching, please do me a favor, like and subscribe over here. Thank you so much.